You won't believe your eyes. The Congresswoman humiliated Senator Adam Schiff today at the US Congressional Conference. This was not just a regular conference. It was a takedown. Now imagine, the chamber was stuck under the cold, unrelenting light. Cameras captured every tense expression, every shift in posture. Silence hung heavy, thick with anticipation. Lawmakers sat rigid, awaiting a moment years in the making. Adam Schiff, once commanding the spotlight, now faced the weight of his own words. Opposite him, Harriet Hageman stood, ready to expose the deception that had shaken the nation. Harriet Hageman stood up and moved with purpose, her step steady but sure, the steady click of her heels cutting through the silence. The podium loomed before her, a place where words held the power to build or destroy reputations. She placed a thick stack of documents onto its surface, letting her fingers press against them for a moment before lifting her head. Across the chamber, Adam Schiff sat motionless, his face unreadable, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Speaker," Hageman began, her voice cutting through the heavy air. For years, Adam Schiff has stood before this body and the American people, claiming one thing over and over again. A pause, the silence deepened, as if the very walls were listening. Schiff shifted slightly, his fingers flexing against the desk. He said he had proof. The words hung in the air like a slow-moving thunderclap. A murmur rippled through the chamber, barely a whisper at first, then swelling into a quiet wave of movement. Some members glanced at one another, expressions unreadable. Others remained rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead. Schiff's lips pressed together, the muscle in his jaw twitching ever so slightly. Hageman lifted a pay from the stack in front of her, holding it between two fingers as if it were a piece of damning evidence. "March 2017, she said, her voice steady. Schiff told MSNBC there is more than circumstantial evidence of collusion. He said it was certainty. He wanted America to believe it." She let the paper drop onto the desk with a soft slap. And yet, when the Mueller report was released, she let the words hang, then quietly, like a judge delivering a final verdict. "No collusion." The chamber tensed. Schiff exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening around the desk's edge. He kept his expression neutral, but the slight crease between his brows betrayed the pressure closing in around him. Hageman didn't stop. She flipped to another page, her movements precise. "November 2018, she continued, Schiff told CNN, Trump's actions are deeply compromising and we will expose it." Another promise. Another declaration. A shift rippled through the room. Some members leaned forward slightly, as if waiting for the next blow to land. Others remained still, unreadable, their hands folded neatly into their laps. "But where was the proof?" Hageman asked, looking up. A pause, a question that needed no answer. "You misled the public," she continued, her tone sharpening. "You fed them a lie. You walked out of classified briefings knowing the truth and told the American people the exact opposite." Schiff inhaled sharply. A muscle twitched at his temple, his fingers curled slightly against the desk. "You convinced them that something was there when you knew it wasn't," Hageman pressed. "And in doing so, you didn't just waste time, you wasted trust." The chamber felt heavier now, as if the very gravity of the accusations had intensified. Schiff's face remained impassive, but his hands were clenched, white-knuckled against the wood. "This isn't about party politics," Hageman said, her voice lowering slightly, but the force behind it remained. This is about truth, about integrity, about the trust that every American places into your elected officials. A beat passed, Schiff blinked, exhaled, shifted slightly in his chair. "And you, Mr. Schiff?" Hageman's voice was razor-sharp now, slicing through the silence like a blade. "You abused that trust." For a moment, nothing moved. The silence wasn't just present, it was alive, stretching between every person in that room, wrapping itself around every held breath. Schiff's jaw tightened, his eyes flickered, but he still said nothing. The press gallery was frantic now, pens scratching against paper, cameras zooming in to catch every detail, every flicker of emotion across Schiff's otherwise controlled face. Hageman inhaled deeply, then with the full weight of everything she had just revealed, she delivered the final blow. "You lied, Mr. Schiff." The words rang out, echoing through the chamber. A finality settled in the air, an invisible but undeniable shift. Schiff remained silent, his grip unrelenting. The walls seemed to close in around him. The real confrontation was just beginning. The room was filled with whispers that spread through the rows of lawmakers, a mix of tension and disbelief hanging in the air. Harriet Hageman stood firm at the podium, her gaze unwavering. Across from her, Adam Schiff remained seated, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening against the desk. She flipped through the stack of papers before her, her expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. "Let's go over the facts," she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. "For years, Mr. Schiff claimed, on television, in hearings, in the press, that he had proof. Not suspicions, not theories, but proof that President Trump colluded with Russia." A quiet shift rippled through the room. Some members of Congress crossed their arms. Others exchanged glances. Schiff exhaled through his nose, but remained silent. Hageman lifted a document. January 2018, Schiff went on CNN and stated, "There is absolutely evidence of collusion." He didn't hedge. He didn't say there might be. He said there is. She let the words sink in before setting the paper down. Schiff's fingers twitched against the disk, but his expression didn't change. Hageman continued flipping to the next page. March 2019, on MSNBC, he said, "Mueller's report will reveal the depth of Trump's conspiracy with Russia." And yet, she looked up, eyes locking onto him. When the Mueller report was released, she didn't wait for an answer. No collusion. No conspiracy. A few lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned back into their seats, arms crossed, while others sat rigid, staring at their desks. Schiff's lips parted slightly, but no words came. "You see the problem, Mr. Schiff?" Hageman asked, tilting her head slightly. "Time after time, you went before the American people and told them that you had evidence. Time after time, you stood here in this very chamber and insisted that you had seen classified information confirming your claims." She let her words hang in the air before pressing on. "But when the investigations concluded, when the reports were released, when every single claim was examined, nothing." Schiff exhaled, his fingers now gripping the edge of his desk. A muscle in his jaw twitched. But still, he said nothing. "And what's worse," Hageman continued, her tone sharp. "Even after every official investigation proved you wrong, even after the truth was undeniable, you didn't stop. You doubled down. You continued to spread the same falsehoods, knowing full well that they had already been debunked." A few members on the Democratic side shifted, some avoiding Schiff's gaze altogether. Others looked straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. Hageman leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just about deception," she said. "It is about consequences. The millions of taxpayer dollars wasted, the trust you shattered, the institutions you weakened." Schiff inhaled sharply, his expression tightening. "You misled Congress," she stated. "You misled the American people. And you did it for one reason, because it served your political agenda." The press gallery was frantic now, pen scratching against paper, cameras zooming in on Schiff's unmoving face. "Tell me, Mr. Schiff," Hageman continued, her voice quiet but firm. "Do you regret it?" Schiff didn't answer. He didn't even look up. The silence that followed was deafening. The chamber was tense. The weight of Harriet Hageman's words settling over the room like a storm ready to break. She stood unwavering at the podium, scanning the faces before her, her voice sharp and deliberate. "For years, Adam Schiff has not just misled this chamber, he has manipulated it. He used his position, his influence, and his authority to create a false reality, convincing the American people that he held the key to a scandal that never existed." A murmur rippled through the room. Schiff sat motionless, his fingers interlocked, his expression unreadable. But the stiffness in his posture, the way he barely blinked, spoke louder than any rebuttal he might have prepared. As chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Hageman continued, Schiff had access to classified briefings, sensitive intelligence, and critical national security information. And instead of using that privilege responsibly, he chose to twist the facts, to present half-truths, to insinuate rather than prove. She picked up a document from the stack beside her. March 2017, Schiff tells MSNBC that there is more than circumstantial evidence of collusion between Trump and Russia. But when asked to present it, he had nothing. A few Republicans nodded in agreement. Some Democrats avoided eye contact. December 2018, Schiff says on CNN that he has seen direct evidence of wrongdoing. And yet the Mueller report, the very investigation his claims initiated, found nothing. No conspiracy. No collusion. She turned towards Schiff. "You had no proof," she said, each word measured. "And you knew it." Schiff exhaled slowly, keeping his gaze fixed forward. Hageman pressed on. "And when the facts didn't match your narrative, you didn't correct yourself. You didn't retract your statements. Instead, you doubled down. You implied that classified briefings contained what public reports could not. You fed the media story after story, carefully crafted to keep the illusion alive." She let the silence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. This chamber was misled. This country was misled. The American people were led to believe in a lie that you built, brick by brick, for political gain. And today, that deception ends. The tension in the room was suffocating. Schiff remained silent, his colleagues shifting into their seats. No one rushed to his defense. Hageman took a step back. "This is about accountability, and we will not stop until it is served." The chamber held its breath. Schiff, once the loudest voice in the room, now had nothing left to say. The air in the chamber grew heavier as Harriet Hageman stepped forward once more. The walls of Congress had heard countless debates, but today there was no usual back and forth. No grandstanding from Schiff. No smug counterattacks. Only the sound of truth closing in. She adjusted the stack of papers on the podium, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Let's talk about the media," she said, scanning the press gallery. "Because Adam Schiff's deception didn't survive on its own. It was fed, amplified, protected. Reporters shifted interview seats. Some scribbled interview notepads while others sat still, knowing exactly what was coming. For years, CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, they all treated his claims as fact. No one questioned him. No one demanded proof. He was given unlimited airtime to spread lies, and they repeated every word. She turned her gaze back to Schiff. He remained motionless, but his jaw clenched ever so slightly. "You used them," she said, her voice quieter but sharper. "And they let you." A murmur rippled through the room. Some Democrats exchanged glances, uncomfortable but silent. Schiff's usual defenders remained still, avoiding his eye. "You sat on prime-time television and claimed to have direct evidence of collusion. You told the American people over and over again that justice was coming. But when the reports were released, when the investigations were completed, what did they find?" She let the silence stretch. "Nothing." A few gasps broke the stillness. Even some of Schiff's allies shifted uncomfortably. "And did the media correct the record?" she continued. "Did they issue retractions? Did they demand answers from you? Number, because the truth was never the goal. The goal was control. And you," she gestured towards Schiff, "gave them exactly what they needed." Schiff's fingers tightened around the disk in front of him. He still didn't speak. "But the damage is done," Hageman said, taking another step forward. "Millions of Americans lost faith in their institutions because of you, because of the media that protected you. And now those same networks, the ones that once paraded you around as the righteous truth-teller, are nowhere to be found." A few reporters sat rigid, avoiding her gaze. They knew she was right. "This is what corruption looks like," Hageman continued. "It is not just one man lying. It is a system built to protect the lie. And that system is collapsing." The tension in the room was suffocating. Schiff sat frozen, the camera zooming in on his expression. He had spent years controlling the conversation, but today he had no words. Hageman exhaled slowly, letting the silence do the rest of the work. The chamber stayed silent. Schiff had no words left. The chamber felt colder now. The weight of Harriet Hageman's words had already shaken the room. But now the discussion turned to something even more infuriating. The cost of Adam Schiff's deception. Not only are there political and economic consequences, but also the erosion of people's trust. Hageman's eyes scanned the room before settling on Schiff. He sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The once confident lawmaker, who had dominated news cycles for years, was now reduced to silence. "This wasn't just a political stunt," she said. "It wasn't just a false narrative spun for television ratings. It was an assault on the American taxpayer." A few murmurs flickered through the room. Even some Democrats, who had sat quietly through most of the proceedings, shifted into their seats. $32 million, Hageman continued. "That's how much was spent on the Mueller investigation alone. 32 million of your money that could have gone to schools, to border security, to veterans, gone." She turned to Schiff, locking eyes with him. He didn't move. His hands were folded tightly in front of him. His expression forced into a mask of indifference. But the tension in his posture gave him away. And after that, she pressed. When the truth came out, when it was clear there was no collusion, no conspiracy, no crime, she let the question hang for a moment. Did Adam Schiff admit he was wrong? Did he apologize for wasting taxpayer money, for dragging this country through years of division? Silence. No, she answered herself. He doubled down. He pushed for impeachment. He demanded more hearings, more investigations, more of your tax dollars. Because if he stopped, if he admitted the truth, his entire house of cards would collapse. A heavy stillness settled over the chamber. Schiff's Democratic allies sat stiffly, some staring straight ahead, others stealing quick glances at one another. You didn't just waste money, Hageman continued, her tone sharpening. You stole something even more valuable, the trust of the American people. She gestured toward the gallery where members of the public sat watching. How many Americans lost faith in your government because of you? How many families were divided? How many people to this day still believe your lies? Schiff inhaled slowly, his eyes flicking toward the press gallery. Cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing every flicker of discomfort. Hageman let the silence stretch before delivering her final blow. The American people deserve better. They deserve leaders who serve them, not themselves. And today, Mr. Schiff, they will get the justice you've been running from. The chamber remained frozen. Schiff still didn't speak. He had nothing left to say. The weight of the moment pressed down on the chamber like an approaching storm. No one spoke, but the silence itself carried tension, thick and suffocating. The decision was near. Harriet Hageman remained standing, composed. Her presence a quiet force in the room. She had laid out the case, exposed every deception. And now it was time for Adam Schiff sat rigid, his usual air of confidence now reduced to a tense stillness. His hands were clasped together on the desk, knuckles white, his breathing controlled, but shallow. His eyes remained fixed forward, unfocused, as if bracing for an impact he knew was inevitable. The speaker's voice carried through the chamber, calm, but firm as the roll call began. One by one, the votes were cast. Each name called like the steady ticking of a clock counting down to an irreversible fate. The Republican side remained unwavering. Each yes landed with finality confirming what had already been clear. Schiff had lost their trust long ago. On the Democratic side, however, hesitation filled the air. Some answered quickly, standing firm in defiance, but others hesitated just a moment too long. A few stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Others exchanged glances, weighing the political consequences of standing by him. Then there were those who said nothing at all. Their silence spoke louder than the votes cast against him. They knew the truth. They had defended him for years, repeated his claims, carried his message, but now when faced with undeniable evidence, they distanced themselves, not through outright opposition, but by simply refusing to stand by his side. Schiff's shoulders tightened. He could feel the isolation creeping in, the quiet betrayal of those who had once stood behind him. The chamber, once a place where he commanded the narrative, now felt like a courtroom where judgment had already been rendered. The final votes were tallied. The speaker glanced down, confirming the results. A breath of expectation hung in the air, the last moment before reality fully settled. Then the gavel struck. The resolution had passed. A wave of applause broke from the Republican side, while across the aisle, reactions varied. Some Democrats sat motionless. Others shook their heads, whispering among themselves. A few turned away, unwilling to witness the conclusion of a spectacle they had once supported. Schiff remained still, his jaw locked, his grip tightening. The weight of the censure settled over him, final and irreversible. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion that crossed his face, anger, disbelief, and somewhere beneath it all, resignation. Harriet Hageman didn't move. She had never needed theatrics. The truth had spoken for itself, and now it was written in the record of Congress. The battle for accountability wasn't over, but today a message had been sent. The tension in the chamber did not ease after the vote. If anything, it thickened, lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. The resolution had passed. Adam Schiff was officially censured, but instead of disappearing into silence, he finally shifted, the weight of the moment forcing him to react. His movements were slow at first, a steady inhale, a measured exhale. Then gripping the disc in front of him, he straightened, his posture rigid but defiant. The years he had spent controlling the narrative, shaping headlines, and maneuvering through Washington's political landscape had not prepared him for this moment. He had always been the one delivering accusations, standing at podiums with unwavering certainty. Now the tables had turned and he was the one under scrutiny. As he rose from his seat, a wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Some of his allies braced themselves, waiting to see if he would fight back. Others sat still, their silence signaling their growing distance from him. The journalists in the press gallery leaned forward, pens poised, cameras zooming in. They wanted a moment, a flash of anger, a final act of defiance, something to feed the headlines. Schiff opened his mouth, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. His expression was carefully composed, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it. Anxiety, maybe even desperation. He had spent years presenting himself as unshakable, as the man who stood for truth and justice. But now with the eyes of the nation upon him, that confidence wavered, the moment stretched. His words came measured at first, an attempt to sound composed, rational. He tried to frame himself as a victim of political persecution, to paint the censure as a partisan attack. But the chamber was no longer the audience he once commanded. The weight of the facts, the evidence, and the sheer exhaustion of years of deception had taken its toll. And then, the moment of collapse. Before he could finish, before he could spin his defense into something tangible, the chamber responded. Not with silence, not with whispers, but with swift and immediate rejection. His own words from past speeches, from televised interviews, from committee hearings, had already betrayed him. The people who once nodded along now sat unmoved. There was no shock, no outrage, just the cold realization that this time, he could not spin the truth. The applause started, not from his side of the aisle, but from the Republicans who had led the charge for accountability, a slow, deliberate crescendo, rising into an undeniable verdict. The sound filled the chamber, cutting through Schiff's words like a sharp blade, his mouth pressed into a thin line. He paused as if realizing, too late, that there was nothing left to say. The room was no longer his stage. The story was no longer his to control. As the applause grew, Schiff sat back down. His grip on the disc tightened. The cameras caught every second of it. his face taut, his eyes flickering with unspoken frustration. The censure was more than a statement. It was an irreversible mark on his legacy. And for the first time in years, Adam Schiff had nothing left to say. The weight of the moment had settled over the chamber like an immovable force. The vote had been cast, the censure was official, and yet the tension did not dissipate. If anything, it deepened. The realization was beginning to sink in, not just for Adam Schiff, but for those who had stood by him for years. The murmurs among the Democrats were no longer whispers of defiance, but of uncertainty, doubt creeping into their ranks. A few had already distanced themselves, avoiding eye contact with Schiff as they exchanged quiet words with colleagues. The silence from others was deafening, their loyalty strained under the weight of undeniable facts. The cracks in his support had been visible before, but now they had widened into fractures. Schiff himself remained still, his back stiff against his chair. His jaw was tight, his hands folded together in front of him as if willing himself to remain composed. But beneath the surface, the reality was inescapable. His name, his reputation, his carefully constructed public image had taken a blow from which there was no recovery. The press gallery was alive with motion. Journalists leaned forward, cameras zoomed in, capturing the rawness of the moment. Not long ago, Schiff had been the media's golden figure, the face of righteous investigations and high-stakes political battles. But now there was no glowing praise, no favorable spin. The silence from his once loyal defenders in the press was as damning as the vote itself. And then the inevitable moment. A reporter in the front row stood, microphone in hand. The room collectively turned toward Schiff, the anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Congressman Schiff, the journalist's voice rang out clear and unwavering. "Do you regret misleading the American people?" The question cut through the air like a blade. All eyes locked onto him. The silence stretched. Schiff's lips pressed together. His throat moved as he swallowed hard. But no words came. The reporter didn't move. The microphone still extended. Another second passed. Then another. The weight of expectation crushed against Schiff. But still, he said nothing. For years, he had commanded the media's attention, using the cameras to spread his version of the truth. Now, in his moment of reckoning, the cameras waited for his defense. And there was none. The lack of response was the response. In the chamber, the shift was undeniable. Some of his colleagues, sensing the futility, turned away. A few exchanged knowing glances, the unspoken understanding settling between them. Schiff had lost his power. The moment stretched unbearably long. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, it ended. The reporter lowered his microphone. The cameras, though still rolling, had captured what they needed. The fall of a man who had built his legacy on words, now left with none. Harriet Hageman remained in her seat, watching. No celebration, no theatrics, just quiet satisfaction. The battle had been fought and the truth had won. Schiff sat unmoving, trapped in the silence he had once used as a weapon. The energy in the chamber had shifted. The battle was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. Adam Schiff sat like a man defeated, his once commanding presence now reduced to quiet isolation. His colleagues, who had once rallied behind him, were now whispering among themselves, some avoiding him entirely. The silence from his side of the aisle was louder than a new speech. Across the chamber, Harriet Hageman remained composed, her face unreadable. She had done what many had tried but failed to do. She had exposed Schiff in front of the entire nation. And now, as the weight of his censure sunk in, a new reality was setting in. Outside the capital, the response was immediate. Conservative media erupted in praise for Hageman, calling her a warrior for truth, a voice of accountability in a Congress that had long lost its way. Social media was ablaze, with clips of her speech spreading like wildfire. In Wyoming, her constituents hailed her as a fighter, a representative who had not only spoken for them, but for every American tired of political deception. But inside the chamber, the air remained thick with quiet tension. The press gallery, once Schiff's greatest ally, had turned cold. The reporters who had once eagerly printed his every claim now sat still, their pens hovering but unmoving. The usual rush to defend him in headlines was absent. There were no sympathetic editorials, no frantic spin to soften the blow. The silence from the media was as damning as the censure itself. Schiff's face remained impassive, but there was no mistaking the truth in his eyes. He knew it was over. Hageman, however, wasn't thinking about Schiff anymore. This fight had never been about one man. Schiff was merely a symptom of a larger problem. A system built on deception, where power came before principle. And as she sat there, watching the fallout unfold, she knew her work wasn't done. Because Schiff wasn't the only one. There were others just like him who had spent years misleading the American people, who had built careers of lies and manipulation. They were still out there, still weaving their narratives, still believing they could escape accountability. But today had proven something different. The truth had won. And Harriet Hageman had no intention of stopping now. Adam Schiff remained at his seat, still and unreadable, though the weight of what had happened was clear. The whispers around him had faded into silence. His allies now preoccupied with their own political survival. The days of unwavering support were over. Harriet Hageman took a slow breath, standing near her desk as she observed the scene. This wasn't victory, not yet. Schiff's censure was a moment of accountability, but the deeper issue remained. Washington's culture of deception didn't begin or end with him. A few reporters loitered in the gallery, still waiting, still hoping for a last-minute moment that could shift the narrative. But there was no dramatic rebuttal, no grand speech to reclaim control of the story. Schiff had lost his voice and the media had lost interest. Their golden figure had become an anchor, dragging them down. Hageman turned toward the exit, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the battle was far from over. Outside these doors, the political machine would churn, scrambling to salvage what remained of its carefully crafted narratives. The Democrats would attempt to regroup, framing the censure as a partisan attack. But the fractures were already showing. Some within their own ranks had refused to stand by Schiff, unwilling to go down with him. She knew this wouldn't be the last fight. Schiff was just one. The real battle wasn't just about punishing a single congressman for misleading the country. It was about restoring integrity to an institution that had been rotting for years. There were others who had abused their positions, others who had manipulated the truth for their own gain. And after today, they knew that time was coming. As she stepped out into the hallway, a wave of questions erupted from the waiting press. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched toward her, voices clamoring over one another. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. The battle for truth had struck its first blow, But the fight was far from over. Adam Schiff's censure was a turning point, a warning that deception in Washington would no longer go unchallenged. Harriet Hageman had set a precedent, one that would echo far beyond the walls of Congress. But this isn't just about one man. It is about a system that has allowed manipulation and misinformation to thrive. So the question remains, who's next? What do you think? Should more politicians be held accountable for misleading the public? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next story.